Entes por parte de la doctora Jana Reims de McKinsey Global Institute. La doctora Reims tiene un PhD en Economía Aplicada de la Universidad de Stanford y una maestría en Economía y Filosofía de la Universidad de Helsinki, Finlandia. Desde 2003 lidera las investigaciones de productividad, competitividad, urbanización, desarrollo económico, integración económica e inversión extranjera del McKinsey Global Institute. Anteriormente se desempeñó como consultora en proyectos de finanzas y estrategias corporativas de McKinsey en Estados Unidos y México. Adicionalmente es miembro del Grupo Asesor de Ciencia, Tecnología e Innovación de la OCDE y de la Iniciativa de Previsión Estratégica del Consejo Atlántico. Recibimos a Jana Reims.
Gracias. Muchísimas gracias por haberme invitado a acompañarlos esta mañana en Bogotá. Debo decir, yo llego del norte de California, que ha tenido una sequedad terrible. Estamos esperando las lluvias como estas con el año de niño. Voy a estar hablando en inglés la mayoría de la presentación, simplemente porque mi español está poco usado en los últimos 10 años o algo así. Entonces, si prefieren, pueden usar tu traducción para el inglés. The theme of productivity, competitiveness and growth has been a core research area for us at the McKinsey Global Institute for 25 years now. And there has never been perhaps a time when the topic is more acute and important in most parts of the world. It is a time when there is so much uncertainty after the first real global recession after the Second World War. And I think the expectation of what's going to come in the future are more uncertain than they have been in a while. So what I will try to do in the next 40 minutes or so is to first put today's economic growth prospects into a global and historical perspective, and then talk a little bit of what it would take for us to change some of the glide path growth projections that we are expecting in the future. And as we all know, future is not given. It is something that we collectively will shape. The decisions we make today will translate into how the world will look like for our children, our grandchildren. So I hope there will be a few ideas that give you food for thought on how you can make the best of the future for Colombia. So let's start by looking backwards. In the last 50 years, the global economy has grown faster than ever before. 50 years ago in 1964, 1965, the global economy was the size of the US economy today. Now we are 6 times larger. So when you look at the chart, we have seen the population of the global economy more than double, and the per capita income of each individual more than double. This has been truly a dramatic shift. We are 6 times larger than we were just 50 years ago, in the lifetime of many of us. And this was not something one would have expected 50 years ago. When you look at the growth rates we have seen until then, for hundreds of years, we grew at rates 1% of GDP, 1.3% between 1900 and 1950. In the last 50 years, we grew by 3 times as fast. It was truly an exceptional economic period. So what does that mean for the next 50 years? We are taking a little bit of a longer-term perspective. Should we expect the good times to continue? Or would something need to change if we wanted to continue at that rate? Well, I'll talk about 3 parts of answer to this question. The first one is the growth rate of the global economy will dramatically depend on productivity growth. Until now, we have had other forces helping us. Now, productivity will be the single growth engine of the global economy. So what happens to productivity will determine how fast the economies will grow and how fast the incomes will grow for all of us. I'll talk about the opportunities to improve productivity by sector, which is important, because that's where you need to look for them. There is less that we can do at the macroeconomic level than we often think. And last, what would it take to actually really crank up the productivity engine? So let's start with why productivity matters more today than it ever has before. In the last 50 years, in this huge growth period, we actually saw, if you think of the output of the global economy as a function of how many people are working and how much each individual produces, or the productivity, in the last 50 years, full 1.7% of annual growth in global GDP came from the fact that we saw more workers enter the workforce. Not only were large cohorts getting to working age, women started to work, etc. This was really a boom of more workers available to expand the global economy. The second half, 1.8%, came from productivity growth. And together those generated a little more than 3% of global growth. When we look ahead, the first engine of this global growth, employment, is really starting to slow down. We are seeing the global, I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble with getting my charts to move on there. But here, when you look over time, we are going to see the global workforce completely slow down their growth and plateau by 2050. So by halfway through the next century, our global workforce will no longer grow. This obviously will not happen at the same time for all of the economies. Germany, Japan, Italy, Russia, their workforces have already peaked. They are having fewer workers than they had in the past. Countries such as South Korea and Japan, which were the growth engines of the last 50 years, their workforces will peak around 2025, in 10 years. Latin America has much more favorable demographics. That plateauing will happen later, closer to 2050, and in some cases even beyond. But this really means that we are seeing one of the growth engines of the global economy completely come to halt. And let's look at what this means for the actual growth rate. As you recall, on the left-hand side, in the past 50 years, the blue graph shows you the 1.7% growth every year coming purely from having more workers. In the next 50, that's going to go down to 0.3% only. Less than 1/5 of the growth rate we had in the past. And if we assume that the productivity growth, which has been pretty robust by historical standards of 1.8%, continues at that rate, even in that case, we would see 40% decline in the global growth rate. If we can't sustain the productivity growth globally, that growth is going to be slower. Of course, the good news is that if we can boost productivity growth, we can potentially really raise the growth path and see a different path than we would expect. What would it take to actually fully recover and make up the decline in the employment growth by accelerated productivity? It would mean we would need to see 1.8 times the productivity growth of the last 50 years. So we would need to close to double the clip at which we are improving on how we do things. A pretty big challenge. And I have more bad news coming your way. When you look at what this means for Colombia, the story is even bigger. The growth rate for Colombia, as well as other Latin American countries, has come even more proportionately from the expanding workforce. More than 3% over the last 50 years. Only 1% annual productivity growth. And that, of course, with the lower birth rates, fewer children per woman, and the large cohort starting to age will mean that the employment growth will decline. And that GDP growth rate would actually be roughly half of what we have had in the last 50 years. This means that unless we do something very differently, we can start having more people participate in the workforce, we can have more women, more young people in productive employment. This is probably what the business as usual outcome would look like. And of course here, if we can improve productivity 3 times, we can meet the same growth rate as we did in the last 50 years in Colombia. So that is a pretty big productivity imperative for everyone. And if you look at the last 50 years and the productivity performance in Colombia as well as other Latin American countries, here we'll see what's happening to the relative productivity of Colombia to the US. Given that the growth rate has not been faster than the US, we have actually been widening the gap. So there was $21,000 per year in the annual gap in output per person in 1992. Now that has widened to almost 30,000. So in many ways, we are falling behind across the board on the capacity of people to be productively employed. And this is the picture we also see in the other developed economies. Sorry. Perhaps you can help me which way I should point so that I would have fewer challenges from this. If I point that way, perfect, wonderful. If that's where I will try that way, that will work. So let's look at a little bit of what happened in Colombia and Latin America when you compare the productivity growth rate to developed economies and other emerging ones. Across the board in the developed economies, the growth, with the exception of South Korea that really climbed from the developing economy status to a developed ones, it has been roughly in the range of between 1 and 1.5%. In emerging economies, the gap has been much wider. There are some really strong performers like China and Turkey. Latin American countries, unfortunately, are not there. Colombia at 1% is actually significantly above Mexico over that time. Today, for example, in Mexico, the average worker is not more productive than they were 30 years at the peak of 1980. It really, as I'm sure many of you are aware, it is the challenge of the region in many ways. And in addition to the fact that the gap on average is widening to some of the global benchmarks, what is happening within these industries in many of the Latin American countries is striking, because we are basically seeing a widening gap between the high productive modern companies and the least productive traditional ones. This data is from Mexico, where we looked at all establishment and looked at how productivity has changed in the 10 years from the turn of the century to 2010 roughly. On the right-hand side of the chart, you can see the large companies with 500 or more inhabitants. 500 or more workers. In these companies, productivity has risen at 6% a year. NAFTA, the deregulation, all of that has really created a different environment, different access to capital, and their productivity growth has frankly been impressive, even by East Asian standards. 6% productivity growth annually, that's very, very good. Unfortunately, when you go to the other extreme, which is the businesses with 10 or fewer employees, productivity has been declining at similar rate. And this share of employment has been increasing. And this means that behind that flat productivity growth, you actually see a widening gap between those who are really being able to compete in the global economy and those that are left behind. The ones in the middle are being squeezed and actually are narrowing down. We are not seeing that kind of dynamic system of companies there. Productivity has been roughly flat, and their share in the global economy has declined. Their share in the employment in the Mexican economy has declined. And this means that we really are not seeing this dynamic of companies growing into mid-tier companies and going into large companies and becoming the kinds of gazelles, as the Americans like to call them, who create new jobs and who bring dynamism into the economy. And this really is one of the key challenges for not just Mexico, but all Latin American countries, where the capacity to bring in the low-performing companies into the rank of globally competitive one is a real barrier. And I think this will unfortunately, of course, mean that incomes on those more than close to half of the workers in the economy is not rising, because oftentimes they get paid what they productively can generate. And that means that the local market is not growing. So unless we can solve the productivity problem for many of these people who work in their small businesses, we can't get the domestic demand to be a fuel of engine of growth. So that is the challenge. Clearly, it will mean that if we want the growth rate in the future to look something different than the relatively pessimistic pictures the demographic story tells, we need to do something about productivity, and we need to do something that is different from what we have done in the past, because clearly that is not helping to solve the problem. Even in the recent past, we are not seeing productivity grow, despite the many of the reforms that many of the regions have seen. So what do you have to do? The first thing I will do is that I want to convince you, in case there's anybody who doubts, that there are enough opportunities and more to meet the productivity growth challenge. There are some people, believe it or not, who think that we have already exhausted a lot of the opportunities. There really is only so little we can do, that we have a limited potential to improve. We definitely don't think so. When we looked at across the globe on 5 industries, agriculture, food processing, automotive, retail, and healthcare, as examples of a broad range of industries, we found potential to boost productivity growth globally to 4%. That is much more than it would be needed to double the past productivity growth and fully make up for the decline in the workforce growth. The best news of that, perhaps, is that fully 3/4 globally of these are from adopting best practices, adopting better practices, diffusion of ideas we already know. This doesn't depend on new innovations. This doesn't depend on the next technology taking root. This really is making sure that we get some of those lessons learned, some of the practices to diffuse from the highly productive firms within Colombia, within Latin America, and globally to the longer tail. And when you look at that, interestingly, half of the opportunity in developed countries, in US, Western Europe, is exactly the same thing. They also have their own long tail, and that's where there's a lot of opportunities for them as well. In emerging markets, it's actually 80% of the whole. So if we want to boost productivity growth in these regions, it is all about making sure that everyone across the board, and particularly the long tail of low-performing companies and low-performing workers, improve their performance. And of course, that has the double benefit of then creating income growth that will fuel more demand, and that'll create more growth for everyone in the economy and all the businesses. And just to give you a quick flavor of what kind of opportunities we are talking about, I don't mean to go through all the dots in here, but I wanted to give you a sense that there is a lot to go around. So we have organized them on an axis where on the right-hand side you see the pushing the frontier opportunities. These are basically new ideas, new innovations, new technologies. And on the left-hand side we have the closing the gap, which is closing the gap to something that others already do better. And you can see wide variety of opportunities across the board. But let me, so I'll give you one or two examples of each one of them. In agriculture, for example, we don't often think about it as the technologically intensive industry, but it actually is one of the most capital-intensive industries in the US, and it is also one where technology continues to push what you can do. Does any of you know what is the largest expected commercial end use for drones? It is not Amazon delivery systems, which is what we tend to think of in Silicon Valley, where I live, but it is agriculture. It is the precision that you can sensor how the fields are doing, and you can optimize where you water, where do you fertilize, etc. We estimate that you can get between 5 to 10% improvements in yields in the US, in the most intensive fields already, by doing that. So clearly, even in agriculture, you have pushing the frontier opportunities. Of course, on the other end of it is all about scale. It's about optimizing fertilizer use, optimizing watering, improvement in logistics so that we can reduce waste. That is a huge, 20 to 30% of all of the production is on waste. And all of these are opportunities that are readily achievable if we can change the way things are done. Auto manufacturing, everything from driverless cars to consolidating some of the small regional producers in China. I think in Latin America, one of the biggest questions is the parts, the replacement parts, which is an industry in itself and tends to be very, very fragmented. That is one where productivity significantly lacks anything that's in the global frontier. Retail. Often not the first industry that people think about, yet it is a critically important industry, not only because it is large and employs many people whose productivity matters, but because it influences the prices to consumers, and thus how lower prices give more purchasing power and make your consumers more valuable resources to fuel the growth. But at the same time, they also influence the efficiency of their supply chain. And here, again, opportunities to move into online platforms, clearly something that will happen across the globe in different parts and different speeds. But particularly in Latin America, the important thing is a shift to more modern formats, more efficient formats from the relatively small fragmented chain. At last, healthcare. This is an industry that, particularly in emerging markets, is a great leapfrogging opportunity. There is no country to look at in the Western world that has done very well on this industry. Productivity is very weak. And there are examples in India, for example. An Aravind eye care company is the world's most productive eye operator. And the way they do is they basically operate more productively than the United Kingdom national healthcare system. They do that in much worse conditions, oftentimes in the rural areas, and they do it with fewer infection rates. And the way they do that is that they have basically adopted Fordian system. They have very large volumes of consumers who come, or patients who come be treated. They have specialized technicians who do a lot of the handling pieces that need to be done so that they are very, very good at each step of what they do. And that really allows them to provide effective healthcare at much lower cost. So this is an area that is going to be growing with the aging, it's going to be growing with income, and where there is large opportunities for the emerging markets, and including Colombia, to really be a leader. And it's also an opportunity where we'll probably see much more Western European baby boomers move out and look for alternative healthcare provision to what they have available in their own home country. So just a thought. And these opportunities, it's easy to see how they really would apply to the long tail of companies across your industries. But it also applies to many of the frontier companies here as well as in the developed countries. So here's one example where we looked at the purchasing excellence, the practices of how you purchase any kind of inputs you have for your production process. We looked at just assessing it in a different step on the processes, how you are doing it, what the scale is, what the costs are, etc. And clearly, even amongst the frontier firms in Colombia, as well as in other countries, this is not different in other countries. I'm not trying to point fingers on Colombia. There is large opportunities to improve across the board. So closing the tail to the global best practice is another opportunity. And then when you look ahead and start thinking about where we might see the next frontiers coming in, there are some technological pessimists who say that we have run out of steam of all the innovation pipeline, and that, in our view, is just incredibly wrong. There has never been a time in the history of when we have looked at the economic pipeline and innovation pipeline where there would have been more opportunities. In the past, we tended to think of technological change as, let's say, Moore's law. We'll see costs of certain products going down. We'll see consumer goods become more efficient, our laptops having more performance than they did in the past. So we saw kind of a curve going down, whether it was Moore's law, whatever you were looking at. And that was the way we thought about technological change. I think we need to change the way we think about it now, because now we have not just the digital computing power, we have big data that influences pretty much any part of your business. We have biotech. Technological innovations are coming all over the place. And the challenge now is no longer to be able to keep up with the curve, but to understand which of these technologies will actually be opportunities or real disruptive changes for your business. And that can be often in ways that you don't anticipate, just like most agro businesses didn't necessarily think that drones would be the ones that would kind of be the next frontier for their business. So for technology, and I know there's going to be a lot more discussion on that with the next speaker, so I won't spend too much time there, but this is clearly an area where I hear from some of the global companies who are saying, we really don't know how to handle this change. We don't know where to invest. It seems like the technology is a real disruptive force that's changing many businesses in a way we have a hard time predicting. So something to think about. And even though we tend to think about this as the drones or the driverless cars or whatever your excitement is, this actually does matter a great deal for the long tail of producers as well. So when we looked at simply the mobile internet, the fact that you have access to information, you have access to communications in the way that you didn't have before, the small and medium-sized enterprises have huge benefits to gain. We surveyed in 15 countries over 2,000 small businesses, and the kinds of benefits those who had access to mobile internet were significant in revenues. They had access to the kinds of contracts, the kinds of sales that they couldn't think of if they didn't have that before. They also, if they were digital, they were able to provide contracts to suppliers who required receipts, etc. They could get significant savings on their purchased inputs because of the fact that they had a broader range. They didn't always have to buy from only those people they knew. You have got overhead cost reductions because you could actually do a lot of things much faster on the web than you could otherwise. And when you put all of that together, you can get significant productivity gains. So ensuring both the penetration and the cost effectiveness of these tools to the long tail can be one part of the solution for making sure the productivity gains go and flow through the whole economy. So clearly, the lack of opportunities is not what's going to keep us from reaching the higher productivity goals we have. It really is that doing this is hard, and if there was a single silver bullet, I am sure every country would have already taken advantage of it. This is hard to do. Many countries have tried, and we have, for 25 years now, studied different countries and different industries trying to do exactly that, raise their productivity and change. And what I'll do next is talk a little bit about 3 lessons learned that we have drawn from having studied this. I mean, in total, we have studied dozens of different countries, and in total, when you take the industries, over 100 different industry case studies. So 3 lessons. The first one really is that regulation matters, but it needs to be tailored to the industry and the sector, and enforcement. Without enforcement, it is not helpful at all and can actually be harmful. What this means is that in many ways, a lot of the debate in the perhaps 20 years before the turn of the century had to do with the macroeconomic stability, which was a big challenge for Latin American countries in many parts, as well as in other emerging and even developed countries, frankly. A lot of that has changed. The macroeconomic stability has improved significantly. And even when there is very uncertain global times, whether it was the downturn of 2007 or the uncertainty right now, the capacity of many of the economies, Colombian included, is actually very impressive when you take it as in the historical context. So there is a lot to be proud and pleased about. Unfortunately for productivity, that's not enough. At the macroeconomic, the stability, the labor laws, the, if you want, capital market flows, all of those matter, but oftentimes when we look underneath the hood, it is sector-level regulations, it is pricing regulations or competition rules that are specific to the industry that actually are keeping change from happening. And this is something that's harder to see because it is so fragmented, but I'll give, and it happens everywhere around the globe. So I'll give you an example, for example. Soviet Union has one of the biggest pools of software talent or any kind of digital talent, and people were afraid that with the liberalization, that pool of folks would actually flood the global IT industry and put prices down and really make them a big hub. They didn't. So Russia never became a software powerhouse, and when we looked deeply why that was, the reason was that they had a small minor code on national security export laws that you can't export anything, any software, before it goes through a national security review. And that often took between 12 to 18 months, which in software is 3 life cycles, which meant there was never a product that would be marketable outside of the Soviet Union. So this is just an example from far away to give a sense of the kinds of things you would never guess unless you look deeper. So let me tell you a few of those examples. In our study, where we were looking at the different industries, we estimated that roughly a third of the productivity opportunities that we identified required some regulatory or government action. Before I go there, though, that means that 2/3 don't. That means that businesses really have a huge part of the solution. 2/3 of the changes that we identify could be done economically today by businesses without any need on the regulation. So clearly this is not just about the government. It's 2/3 of the private sector and 1/3 by the government. But let's talk about the government role instead. In retail, for example, a lot has to do with zoning the capacity of new entrants to come and play, particularly new and more efficient formats. In some cases, that's restricted by limiting foreign entrants. In some cases, it is limited by zoning of lot sizes, how large formats you can have. In some cases, it is just local permitting that the local businesses, existing businesses, don't want others to come in. We saw that in Sweden, for example, where they wanted to really retail to become more productive. They changed their laws to increase competition, change zoning, but they realized that it was the local governments where they really didn't want a big box store to come down. And it was only when the central government actually went after the local regulation that opened up the competitive dynamic on the industry. And for the next 10 years as a result, retail in Sweden grew twice as fast. Retail productivity grew twice as fast as the European average, and they really became a transformative force for other industries around the globe. IKEA is, for example, from there, so there's many benefits that come when you learn to compete in your own market. You can then transfer that to the global business. Automotive, similarly, a lot of that has to do with protecting local plants, whether it's China or Western Europe. In agriculture, a lot has to do with logistics. In addition to pricing, etc. But logistics is important because refrigeration and other factors that, even just the road quality, how long it takes, all of that matters for the capacity of products to get into the market in time. So a third roughly globally, more than that in emerging markets. Clearly there is work for the government to do, but as I said, we don't need government to do a good chunk of that. I think the private sector can take a lead. So what do we need the government to do? As I said, we have already seen the macroeconomic environment improve significantly. And I think there is plenty of economists, I can talk bad about economists because I'm one of them, but there's plenty of economists in the region and globally who know what the right answer here roughly is. The challenge is you should really get to the next sector and take away some of the barriers for industry growth and prosperity and productivity across the different industries. And we found it very useful to think of the industries based on where really are the levers that matter for their competitiveness, productivity, and growth. And we thought two dimensions were important. On the horizontal axis, we have the tradability. Clearly, it matters whether your competition is local, as it is in, let's say, retail or trade services or utilities, or if it is a global industry like mobile phones or even I would say, mobile phones, computers, anything that's really fast-moving, medical instruments, etc. The ones on the right end, the R&D intensive manufacturing, those tend to be industries that are fully global. They are fragmented by steps. So if you do flash drives, you don't do the plastics, you don't do the software. All of these can be done in different parts. These industries are typically very fast moving, partly because of the fact that it is so specialized. People can really push on their different frontiers. And also competition is really, really hard. So to stay and compete on that area, you need to be globally competitive every day. It's not enough that you were that last year. On the other extreme, then you have local services, which is in the middle. This tends to be smaller in scale. You can have global competitors, but they often operate very, very locally. It is not really that you can't export most of retail services, hospitality services, etc. And here, the success to real high performance is a dynamism of the fact that you can have industries not only adjust to the shifting consumer demand, but improving operations, having restaurants take over the ones that are not succeeding as well, which is something where you see, this is an industry where you see a lot more turnover than anywhere else. And if you think of these different segments, it's not surprising that the kinds of policies that work for making them productive and competitive are also different. Here, the way we think of the government regulation is to going from, on the left-hand side, the least invasive, if you want, to the most interventionist on the right-hand side. You can set the ground rules and regulations, which is basically the rules for how to do business, rules for the product markets as well as the labor and capital markets. The second one is building enablers. Not only are you going to tell the markets on how to operate, but you are actually investing on infrastructure that makes them more efficient and makes them more competitive. You might bring talent, you might be very targeted on building certain kind of talent because you want to help make sure that grows, etc. Third one is then you tilt the playing field, in which case you either protect your market from global competition, you create favorable conditions for local production, or you provide incentives. This is another tool that we all know is heavily used across the globe everywhere else. And then there is the direct operator, the government as a principal actor. And when you overlay the different kinds of industries and the different kind of interventions, it is actually interesting that different industries that succeed tend to have different kind of government support. This is the way the picture looks like for us. So the R&D intensive manufacturing, that was the computers and mobile phones, it's on the right, on the top. This is interesting because in many ways, these are the industries that most of regions, when they're looking to build a new cluster, they often focus on these activities. Today, simply having the right ground rules and direction seldom leads to a successful company. This is something that, for example, we looked at in detail on semiconductor industry and what has happened. A lot of regions are trying to invest and build the capabilities, working together with the private sector, but because this is a very competitive industry, most of them don't succeed. That's the rules of the market. So when you look at, for example, when you look at the semiconductor industry investment, so here is roughly the timeline. All of these are literally measured in billions, the kinds of support that these regions have gotten for building their semiconductor industry. Some of them have been successful for the long term, most of them have not. So in many ways, on these R&D intensive activities, you need government enablers, you need the skills, you need the infrastructure. You oftentimes need government as a partner in even tilting the playing field early on in the stage. Yet, the odds of success are low because this is a competitive industry. And this is something to keep in mind for countries that are thinking about using industrial policy to boost certain industries. You need to go in with a very different mindset. These are risky businesses, and you need to be able to not just understand where your odds of success are the best, but also where you might be able to pull back, or where you might have to pull back when the investments clearly don't become what you would like them to become. On the other end of the spectrum then are, On the other end of the spectrum then are the services, which, as you may recall, these were the ones where you have largely local businesses, where the dynamism of the industry matters. And on the graph, which I want to show you so that I can, on the bubble chart, this actually is an industry where you pretty much can determine by the rules of law where exactly you are going to end up on your performance. I'm trying to go one more page back. Yes, here, thank you. So look at the local services. This would be retail. Basically, when we look at any country, we can pretty much tell the overall performance based on where the industry is. It is, I'll tell you, with the example of the developed economies. The very productive industries are the ones where you actually have no zoning, where you see competition be high, really large formats, you see efficient productive formats come effective and grow fast, while employment is high in industries where you typically don't. So you see Japan and South Korea that's full of small formats, while in Sweden, France, and Germany you see much more modern formats. However, there you see labor regulation, high costs mean that your employment is not high. US, on the other hand, has both liberal labor legislation as well as zoning laws that allow you to be successful. That means that they have succeeded in both creating productivity and employment on the industry. In emerging markets, it's not just about the labor regulation and the zoning, though. It is also critically about informality. And this applies to many other industries. And this is really the challenge of the long tail. And it is the fact that more productive formats can't compete. In this case, this is a real example of Brazil, when you increase the labor productivity by over 30% by moving into a modern format, but you lose the savings from evading taxes. When you become a formal company, your profit margins evade. And this is a real challenge, because if you have a small, successful, well-managed informal company, you don't want to grow into a size that you start getting the benefits of scale and grow. This is why we are not seeing the middle growth, if you want. And at the same time, it also doesn't allow modern companies to acquire these formal ones and grow that way. And often, if you boost your regulation, if you deregulate, things can happen very quickly on these domestic industries. Whether it's retail, whether it's logistics, things will change fast, and that is the really great news. The second message is that services is the key to productivity and job growth. When you look at where jobs have grown, it is striking that even amongst the least developed economies, more than 2/3 of all net job growth comes from services. In the middle-income economies, like Colombia, more than 90%. In developed economies, much more than 100%. That's where jobs needs to be coming. And this is when you look at, for example, Colombia's productivity growth. Unfortunately, we have seen mining, financial intermediation, construction actually closing the gap to the US. This is an index of how productivity is evolving relative to the global benchmarks. Retail, leisure, and hospitality, it's actually the gap continues to widen, and that's where 33% of the employment is. So these are really the industries that will make a difference for the global growth, for the national growth overall, because they are so large employers. Without changes in these sectors in productivity, the overall economy won't grow. And last, competition is rising between regional growth initiatives. And this is my last point, which I think is an interesting thing. I've been watching the space of industrial policy for more than 10 years now, and China and the US actually have a pretty similar approach now. both of them say they have a federal government that is not doing industrial policy. They provide incentives overall, and they have local regions compete for those incentives. So let me start with the China example, where you have seen the federal government or the China's central government go from being the real operator at the ground level, running a lot of the plants even, to become really a strategic leader who, for example, set a goal for wind technology. China wants to become a big wind power. They ran a competition for funding for local consortiums that needed to have the local government, local business, and an international partner. And they competed with the proposal. There was a first round of funding, and after that, the federal government let it run for a while and saw who were the successful ones who actually brought in profits and revenue growth. And then they gave the second funding, and that was the way they were running their industrial policy, if you want. Very much a competition-driven, and frankly, in some cases, more successful than others, but with a number of quite successful examples already. And this is very much what we have seen happen in the US for a long time. The federal government says they have no industrial policy. They do have funds for different kinds of things, but it is really the states and the local governments that operate in a very similar way, in a collaboration between local government and local business to create growth. And I think that's something that creates a food for thought for Colombia and for Latin America. This is a region where urbanization happened in the second half of the 20th century, where it was largely in the import substitution period. That means that a lot of the growth happened in the top cities. So the top 10 cities in Latin America across the board have a higher share of GDP of the region than anywhere else in the US or in China. And if you think of the diversification and the rise of the broad base of cities, making sure that there is the capability to operate across the regions, not just in the central hubs, for that sustained growth that happens on the long tails of the industries and the long trains of the regions is going to be important. So with that, our message is that productivity really will be the key, but it will take a lot of work across the board, and particularly moving away from the national level to the long tails across industries, as well as the regional long tail, to make sure that we actually are able to raise the broad base of productivity and income. That will continue to be then the engine of growth for not just Colombia or the region, but globally. Thank you very much.
Continuamos con la doctora Jan Yuri y su conferencia Modelos Internacionales de Transferencia Tecnológica. La doctora Yuri posee un PhD en Ciencia Política de la Universidad de Emory. Actualmente se desempeña como la investigadora principal del Instituto de Innovación Empresarial del Instituto de Tecnología de Georgia. Es profesora en las escuelas de políticas públicas y de planificación urbana y regional del mismo instituto. Asimismo, ha sido investigadora principal en los estudios contratados por el Departamento de Comercio de Estados Unidos, la Fundación Nacional de Ciencias, la Comisión Europea, el Programa de Desarrollo de la ONU, entre otros. Recibió el premio Lang-Rosen de Oro al mejor artículo publicado en el Journal of Technology Transfer. También ha publicado en revistas como Research Policy, Economic Development Quarterly, Technovation, entre otras. Recibimos entonces a Jan Yuri.